Hey, thank you for joining this live stream. I'm Jamie Bykov-Brett. I run an organization called Distributed Republic, where we look into how things like Web3 and the Metaverse will all come together and essentially how we can help add value. So my role is as a Metaverse advisor. So a lot of what I do is trying to think about how we can utilize Metaverse technologies for essentially social, political, and economic aims. My background actually was in youth work originally, but I came through to trying to use, at the beginning of the pandemic, thinking about how we could use the metaverse as an educational tool. And then that kind of turned into developing virtual reality conferences and events. Like at the beginning of this year, I did a conference that was entirely in VR with 50 people over 3 days. And we designed all the virtual reality events and conferences and all of the environment that they were participating in. So today's one, what I wanted to do is give you a look at a report that's come out by McKinsey Company. It's called A Value Creation in the Metaverse, and it's probably the most meaningful publication that I've read in terms of the metaverse and what we can expect for the next 10 years when then looking at how the metaverse is going to develop. So the whole purpose of this report is essentially looking at how real businesses can utilize virtual worlds in order to be able to leverage them, in order to be able to make the most from them. And the aim is to look at that between now and 2030, which is when we should really start to be seeing when we're going to get more value from metaverse products. And obviously there's a long roadmap to be able to get there in between times. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through some of my key findings that I've taken out of the report, things that I thought were really interesting, things that I could see that are going to develop in a very meaningful way, and just share them with you to be able to run through and maybe discuss in a bit more detail how I could see that having an impact on us as we delve into the metaverse. So this report took on board 3,400 consumer opinions and executives on the metaverse and its adoption and the potential for how it might shift behaviors. The report's aim was to basically develop a bit of a dialogue around the development of the metaverse and to help leaders to understand the potential, to identify some of the strategic objectives, and to think about the positive evolution that we could have with it. So the technology stack for the metaverse consists of 4 building blocks, according to this report: content and experiences, platforms, infrastructure, and hardware and enablers. And I think that's really important to look at, because when we are thinking about the metaverse, it can come across as quite an overwhelming subject with lots of nuance, lots of different perspectives on it. And being able to break it into these 4 blocks really helps us to start to understand some of the services that are coming out of the metaverse and organizations and how they're getting involved. So you probably hear a lot from things like Apple are developing a headset, so they're more focused on the hardware side of things, whereas an organization like Spatial is more focused on how do they create that content and experience platform. Also, feel free if at any point you have any questions or you want to be able to put anything in the chat, more than happy to help answer any questions that you might have relating to the metaverse, Web3, decentralization, and AI. So, looking at some of the report notes that I've got here, I think one of the interesting bits that really came out here is that corporations and venture capitalists and private equity firms have already invested 120 billion in 2020 into the metaverse, and this is largely driven by large tech companies. Also, 95% of business leaders expect it to have a positive impact within the next 5 to 10 years. And 61% expect it to at least moderately change their industry operations, which is massive when we're starting to think about how the metaverse can impact all of these different sectors. I'll give you some examples of some organizations that I'm connected with at the moment and what we're doing. But digital twinning is a massive aspect of that as well. So looking at how we can create digital twins, which is essentially a virtual version of a physical space, and what that might start to look like. And how people might be able to participate within those spaces as well. So a good example is Accenture have done something called the Nth Floor, which is essentially their metaverse floor. And what you can do there is when you're participating in those spaces, you can go along to a virtual version of a material space and have those kind of chance interactions, which is what you miss out in a lot of workplaces at the moment. So there's wide-reaching implications across all organizations. All organizations are looking at how can they redefine their buildings and their estates and stuff like that, because it makes a huge difference after COVID with how people are actually engaging within the office, and whether they need to have a big office where everyone can have a seat when only, a quarter of the people are in the office on a day-to-day basis. So the fact that 95% of people think that that's going to have an impact on their industry is absolutely massive. So let's have a look at some of the next bit on here, some of my other notes. So I suppose the big finding from this report, and this is like the headline that everyone's putting in articles and stuff like that, is that it may generate up to 5 trillion by 2030, which is the equivalent to Japan's economy today. Obviously, when we talk about these numbers, we're talking big figures, and that's what attracts people to being able to read these things. And, it's interesting to be able to see. And I can completely see why they would feel that 5 trillion is a very kind of attainable figure for what the metaverse can provide, because the metaverse, sometimes we can get kind of coined on the terms of metaverse and Web3 and all this kind of stuff. But what we're really talking about is the future of the internet and the future of e-commerce. And both of those things together will have an impact on all of our transactions and the way that we engage with our online worlds. So the fact that the e-commerce market could be impacted about 2 trillion to 2.6 trillion, the academic value for virtual learning to be between 180 billion and 270 billion. They're large amounts, and I can completely see the value as we're already developing some educational materials within that metaverse space. Off the top of my head, that I know that virtual reality technologies have a 26% higher emotional reaction, are engaged with for 36% longer, which is why they have such value as an educational tool for being able to get people engaged and involved within these spaces. So some of the things that consumers are interested in is they're excited about transitioning everyday activities to the metaverse, such as entertainment, gaming, travel, shopping, socializing. Shopping could be a great example, being able to be in a virtual store, and let's say it's IKEA and you don't want to have to trawl around the whole store. What you want to do is you want to have a look at your virtual spaces, see what that furniture looks like, maybe use an AR filter to drag it out of your virtual space and then bring it into your physical location to see what that piece of furniture would look like. It's very doable, it's very feasible to be able to have that. And you can see that's why a lot of shops are investing within these metaverse technologies and these spaces. What else we got going on here? So enterprises are using use cases include things like marketing campaigns, initiatives, learning and development for employees, meetings in the metaverse, product design, and digital twinning. So a huge range of applications that we can start to use this for, because when we talk about the metaverse, we're essentially just creating virtual worlds, and every building, every organization can benefit from creating virtual worlds to enhance their operations. So let's have a look. Some of the challenges that remain will be like developing a fully functioning metaverse, technically feasible networks, and being able to get people to be able to connect to a metaverse for faster, with that quicker internet connectivity. And this is why when I talk about the metaverse, I don't really think of it as just one thing alone. When we're looking at the metaverse, what you're really looking at is this convergence of digital technologies. So that is things like your 5G networks, hugely going to be like 5G networks are going to have a massive impact on being able to engage in metaverse spaces, because the technology of that connectivity is the essential infrastructure that you need. A standard internet technology, if we're looking 5-10 years in advance, will not be fast enough to develop and to maintain these virtual worlds. Then what we're also looking at is things like Web3, so decentralized infrastructure, using things like blockchain and crypto and tokenomics for being able to do this value exchange on the metaverse spaces. You've then got the metaverse as well, so these virtual worlds to be able to participate in, for people to be able to engage in. You've also got things like, as I said, 5G, which lays the infrastructure in place for these things to happen, and even just the mindset of decentralization as well. That's going to be really, really important for people being able to participate. So it's not just this one technology at a time, it's the fact that you have this convergence of digital technologies all happening at once. And that's what makes things like the metaverse relevant to the times that we live in. And also we're looking at some of the attitudes that have changed as well because of COVID. When we were thinking about technology and even people working from home, that would have made a huge difference to people's participation, because people now have an understanding that we are going to be working from home, so they do need to think about different ways that people are able to engage in these virtual spaces. So some other really interesting stuff to come out of this report is that the metaverse is really the next iteration of the internet. So it's basically, how can we combine our virtual and material worlds? If you haven't come across it yet, there's a terminology that's used in these spaces quite a lot, which is called phygital, which is the mixture between our physical and our digital spaces and how they all connect together. I think later on in the report as well, we were looking at some of the statistics around digital identity, and 70% of US citizens said that they found that their digital identity was as important as their day-to-day identity. That's absolutely crazy when we think about, we've only really had digital identities for at maximum 30 years. And now they're a really important part of people's day-to-day life and the way that they perceive themselves. So that's a huge change, an attitudinal change that's made it so the metaverse is really relevant to what's happening in people's worlds. Just going to grab a cup of tea. So let's have a look at some more details in this report. So there's three areas that are really important features of metaverse spaces, which is immersion, real-time activity, and user agency. And these aspects are kind of what form our metaverse spaces. So that's what designs our value experience within the metaverse. There's also a case of looking at how the metaverse can exist on multiple platforms at once. So at the moment we see a lot of metaverse blockchain land bases. These are things like Decentraland, Fortnite, Minecraft, Sandbox. They essentially create scarcity by creating blockchain land, which is a virtual land that you can build on. And that started to add value to people being able to participate and build these virtual spaces, is by creating a land mass on which to be able to build these environments. And what you see is things like, if your land is next to something that's really important, like the Adidas building, if you're building a store in a virtual land, being able to then go, actually, we're quite next to somewhere that has a huge footfall, that makes a massive difference to the amount of visitors that you're going to get within your virtual store. So not only do we have virtual land that's created by scarcity, but we have value on different places of that virtual land. So let's have a look what else we've got in this report that's really interesting. I've just got my notes at the side here. So a VR is important for the interface for the metaverse, but it's not the exclusive way that people can engage with the metaverse. So when we talk about the metaverse, quite often people associate it with VR because it's one of the technologies that you can use to engage within those virtual spaces. However, metaverses just refer to the virtual environments that people participate in. So it's not limited by just the fact that people are able to put on a VR headset and be able to go into those virtual worlds, but you should be able to access it via other devices. So things like your computer, mobile phones, and VR headsets. Some of the platform characteristics include things like organizational structures, payments, payment infrastructure, digital asset ownership, being able to build that portability and enable people to kind of use native tokens within those virtual spaces. So it's mentioning that these are all things that are really important within that metaverse infrastructure. This next bit I found really interesting, which is men prioritized connectivity and real estate when it came to the metaverse, while women were most excited by avatar customization and events. I'll give you a story of someone that I know that I've been doing a lot of work with, and we were talking about avatar creation and the impact that that's been able to have, and how much digital fashion is going to influence participation within the metaverse. So he's got a young child who was asking for Christmas presents this year, and they were saying, hey, what I would like to be able to do is I want to be able to have new clothes, new shoes. And the person whose parent is of this young child was like, what on earth do you need that? You've got new shoes, you've got coats, what are you looking for? And she's like, no, you don't understand. It's not for me, it's for my avatar. And that already shows that changing spending habits that we're having within these virtual spaces, to now be able to associate the fact that we want to be able to dress and customize our digital avatars and have a phygital fashion. So all of these things are building to that metaverse e-commerce. So the metaverse can be broken down in, I think we spoke about this already, can be broken down into content experiences, platforms, infrastructure, and hardware enablers. Metaverse platforms have attracted companies such as Nike, Gucci, and Fortnite has generated over £14 billion in transactions. Now, Fortnite's one of those metaverse spaces that is very much evolved to have a whole ecosystem around it. But being able to generate that £14 billion of revenue just goes to show how valuable virtual worlds where people are participating in a meaningful way can be, and how profitable it can be for organizations. This one I found really interesting, which was a bit of a one that's just out of the woodwork, but I found as a very interesting statistic, which is an anonymous user purchased virtual land next to Snoop Dogg's Snoopverse for £450,000, which is huge amounts of money for being able to buy virtual land. And it goes back to what we were saying earlier about the scarcity of virtual land, and how being next to something with value creates value for the land that you're near. So it'll be interesting to see why they've bought that and what gets developed within that space, to be able to look at how people are going to leverage this metaverse land to be able to make profit from it, really. So our next one on here that I found really interesting. So some of the big investors in the space at the moment are Adidas, HSBC, Tokens.com. They're some of the more institutional investors, while a lot of people are also investing in virtual architecture to be able to build that infrastructure. And that's what I do a lot of with my organization MetaHub, is we develop the virtual reality architecture and the metaverse architecture for people to participate in virtual spaces. So 2021 investment figures. So over $120 billion has been invested into the metaverse since 2021, doubling from 2020's figure of 57 million. So a huge amount of investment that has been put in recently over the last year, particularly since Meta's announcement, that has kind of started to thrive this metaverse space. Now, I'm not a huge believer in Meta's metaverse vision. They want a centralized version of the metaverse where essentially it's almost like owning the internet, whereas I have a much greater belief in the idea of a decentralized internet. So how we can all make sure that our decentralized metaverse, which kind of makes sure that ownership is not owned and centralized by one organization, but is decentralized across multiple servers, meaning that it's not owned by a single entity. But there's different versions and different models of the metaverse, and people are kind of debating which one's which and who's going to be involved with what one, and these things are all kind of developing at the same time. So as we said, one of the large companies that's invested in metaverse is Meta, but also organizations like Microsoft, Nvidia, Apple, Alphabet. All of these companies are investing within metaverse spaces, which is pretty much every large tech firm that's out there. A little bit on the 5G bit, which I think is really useful to be able to touch on as well. So 5G is enabling these virtual worlds to be able to take place. whereas things like Unity and Unity Engine have been used as a way to kind of reduce the barriers of creation. So there's tools that people are able to access to be able to get into the metaverse. But 5G will be a key in facilitating like cutting edge technology and computing. However, that's going to kind of just be the base level infrastructure to really do the sophisticated uses of the metaverse. We're probably going to be looking at the next evolution of that, 6G, to be able to really benefit from the implementation of metaverse technologies. So some of the areas that people were really interested in when it came to the metaverse, the large one and the one that's probably the most prominent is socializing, but also things like fitness is really important and an area that people have a huge interest in. There's an organization called the Virtual Reality Fitness Institute, and they measure how much energy you actually utilize when you're engaging in a virtual reality game or training program. And the thing is, people tend to work out for harder, for longer, and think that they're doing less when they're playing a virtual reality space. One of the things that I got into when I got started with a VR headset was doing a boxing game, and it was because it was during COVID and I couldn't go outside and I couldn't do sports. And I tell you what, I would be absolutely sweating from it every time that I was in there, because you would just expend so much energy on being able to partake in a physical activity. So I think it'll be a massive area for a lot of this metaverse aspect and how people utilize it in a meaningful way. So some of the people that are doing a lot within the space, like BMW, are utilizing NVIDIA's Omniverse to build a digital twin, digital factory twin, which is expected to kind of help them to improve their supply chain efficiency. It's also reckoned that about 50% of activities can be improved with automation, digital twins, and 3D and 4D printing. There's a few different kind of cases out there that I think it's, from a statistics point of view, are really interesting. So 70% of general consumers rate their digital identity as important or very important. I touched on this earlier, and I find that absolutely fascinating, because it just goes to show how we're going to have to shape mindsets and how we're going to have to support people to do some sense making of that digital identity, because there's not a lot of resources in there, and lots of people who grew up with the internet have not really been told how to make sense of a digital identity, because it just wasn't something that was on the curriculum, it wasn't something that was understood. But it's going to be really, really important for metaverse spaces, because when we're starting to look at a digital identity, particularly when it comes to things like avatar creation and stuff like that, is in a digital space you can reflect yourself however you want to be able to do that. And that could be very liberating for some people, that could be very meaningful, but we also need to be able to help people make sense of that, because how are they going to feel when they don't look like that, when they look different within a physical environment? And could that have an impact on how people perceive themselves? What kind of associated psychoses could there be? What kind of associated mental health problems could be implicated within that? For example, when we introduced, social media, we didn't really think about the unintended consequences that kind of technology could have on people's participation. And yet now we start to look at it and go, oh, we can see how these conditions have developed because of social media. And this is because we don't really regulate technology in any kind of meaningful way. And we don't really think about these unintended consequences, but it'll be massive when we're looking at metaverse, because it's that extra level of immersion and that erosion between our virtual and our material worlds. So one of the other aspects in this report that I found very interesting, so investors that are staking a position early could be disrupted by major developments in the space. So you've got the upside if you invest early, then there's chances of being able to make some major gains, but also there's a lot of disruption as these things are coming through and we're starting to learn the value and the impact of these technologies. 60% of customers are excited about the transition to everyday activities in the metaverse. 66% of people expressed an enthusiasm and interest for attending live events, gaming, shopping, and travel within virtual worlds. One of the aspects that I think is really important within this space is that the travel sector could be something that's revolutionized by virtual reality, being able to visit anywhere and experience everything, just to be able to go to these spaces and experience worlds that you either wouldn't have ever had the opportunity to, or could be entirely created in order to capture your imagination. Some of the barriers, the top 3 barriers that are out there for the metaverse spaces, according to McKinsey's report on creating value within the metaverse, there's a lot of uncertainty around investments. 31% of people express that. There isn't really a business model for metaverse tech. It's very new. It's a couple of years old, so people haven't really thought about the ins and outs of that. So 29% of people expressed a concern with that. A lack of managerial capability at the moment, so it's a very new tool. They haven't really thought about how it's going to be implemented and the value of that implementation. The bottom 3 barriers, which are probably the ones that are more current day problems, but not necessarily the ones that the front of people's minds, is to the worried about being able to integrate data across systems. I think that's a bit of an interesting one, because I would think that would be quite important. Interoperability is a massive part of metaverses, so being able to take an asset from one digital space and maybe be able to utilize it in another, but it's not what people are expressing as a concern at this point. People aren't expressing a concern around the lack of computing infrastructure and hardware. Once again, that surprises me a little bit, because the biggest barrier a lot of the time is people being able to use a computer with current graphics cards, or that aren't set up for being able to develop these large metaverse spaces. Also being able to connect to the internet. If you think about how many people struggle connecting to a Zoom call, and then think about how many people struggle connecting to a virtual space, a virtual world, which eats a hell of a lot more data, it surprises me that that's not a bigger concern for people. There's a lack of access to external funding for tech investments. That's apparently not people's top concern. Maybe because there is quite a lot of funding that's accessible, as we've looked at in this report. We're talking about billions of pounds and almost 3 times the amount of money invested in 2022 in comparison to 2021. So, some of the other big investment calls here. The fact that AI is being invested in so heavily is expected to increase the value of the metaverse and that economic value that it's supposed to have. That's because things like AI are a key building block for metaverse technologies. Being able to utilize AI systems will be essential for our metaverse infrastructure, essentially. By 2020, the metaverse could generate up to by 2030, the metaverse could generate 4 trillion to 5 trillion across consumer enterprises. That's the big finding from this report. That's the one that they keep hammering home throughout it, because it's where they see the most value. People are going to go, hey, something that's worth £5 trillion is something that I want to be a part of. So, some of the other advice in here that was really interesting. Education, there's just some good case studies in here. One of them being the University of California is using a virtual campus for real-time lectures and breakout spaces, and for outdoor areas for people to participate in learning. Virtual tourism, so Arriva Digital's Wonderland platform is working to connect people to allow them to participate using virtual travel, basically. So either to imagined or recreated destinations, which is really something new, something that we haven't necessarily seen before, but also something relatively familiar. Google Maps and being able to see these virtual spaces or 360-degree videos have actually been around for quite a long time. But now it's just that next level of being able to create that immersion. Let's have a look what else. So Gaming skin market, so this is where you can change avatar design or environment design. That reached about $40 billion in 2020. One of the other aspects that it brings up here, which I think is a key factor for metaverse development, is token gating. So this is where you can essentially use something like an NFT to be able to create a key or access to specific spaces. So essentially it allows you to create a digital community or a lock where you can go, hey, if you've got access to this token, you're able to get into this virtual world. And that's going to be a massive impact on our metaverse spaces. You could design a metaverse apartment, as it were, and you could sell your NFT as the key to be able to get in. And if you don't have that token gated aspect to it, you might not be able to engage and participate or be able to get into that virtual space. So it creates that scarcity again. It creates that opportunity to create that exclusivity, and that's what people are really looking for when they're looking at these metaverse spaces. Good piece of advice that comes through on here, which is it's probably best to collaborate with established tech partners. So a good example is something that Lego did with Epidemic Games when they were trying to enter the metaverse. So they paired with people that are already established within the space. Not that there's lots of people that are very established in the space, but there's definitely more of them being able to kind of build that value. And that comes down to a little bit of what we call fansumerism. So being able to sell to your fans, being able to leverage the fan base of one place to be able to get your clients to be able to participate within it as well. I'm going to have a look at just a few more little points on this article now. So, XR technologies. This is one I found really interesting and also a little bit scary, which is XR technologies, which includes VR and AR. It can collect eye tracking data such as blink duration and frequency and pupil size, reactivity, facial attributes, and intrinsic characteristics. And one of the reasons that I found that quite an intimidating factor is all of this information might be used to be able to create better experiences for us or more reactive experiences, but it also could be able to go, well, how we can tell what sells really well, or we can really value that emotional reaction. So at the moment we look on a click rate and we go, well, this link must have been very good because lots of people clicked on it. And I suppose it's that next level of that of going, well, now we know a little bit more, we can entirely see how somebody reacts to a piece of content and what that might mean for them moving forward, and how we might therefore sell something to them or try to influence them. How do we know what they like? How do we know what they don't like? So that will be interesting to see how that develops, and also what's the kind of ethical implications and the regulation that needs to be in place to measure some of that. So some steps that you can take to kind of prepare your business for the metaverse if you're looking to develop a strategy. These are the ones suggested by the report, and I think they're really good and quite insightful. So step one is develop a value-focused strategic stance on these two steps, which is to define your metaverse goals, such as whether you want to generate demand across existing on new segments, build communities, or create revenue streams. And the second one is determine your role you want to play by building those experiences and facilitating interactions and the infrastructure that enables those interactions. Number two is test, learn, and adopt, and you can do that in 3 steps. So the first one is to launch initial activities, create those use cases, explore opportunities to be able to utilize things like NFTs, to be able to create those immersive experiences, to look at native advertising, and to be able to have a metaverse present. The best thing to do if you want to get involved with something is to get involved with something. The second step of that is to monitor the near-term results from that and refine them for your long-term potential by identifying the right metrics and initial activations and testing and for your long-term monetization options. So really think about how you can start to use some of that short-term data to be able to develop a strategy for your long-term vision. And the third one there is to learn more about users by examining behaviors on platforms such as undertaking primary research. Let's start to see how people do react to these spaces, start to collect feedback, start to understand why people are participating, what the value is for people participating, and start to grow things from there. So the third step within this is to prepare to scale, and you can do that in 2 steps. So first of all is to identify and start scaling capabilities through sourcing talent required and establishing the necessary technology and infrastructure and tooling that you need in order to be able to participate within these virtual worlds, and to start to think about how you're going to utilize them to be able to potentially take your small virtual spaces and take it to a longer term vision of how people will participate in that space. The next one is to start to embed the metaverse in your business. So what is your strategy and operating model for the business in the metaverse, while identifying who will drive these initiatives within your organization? So start to develop a metaverse strategy, particularly aiming for 2030. There's a few organizations that I've been with that are now developing how they can participate within the metaverse within the next 8 to 9 years, because they want to be able to know how they're going to leverage this technology. As I said before, it's not just about the metaverse or Web3, it's the future of the internet and the future of e-commerce. And both of those aspects are going to be really important to any business. If you think about a business 20 years ago and you said to them, hey, I think you should do something about getting involved with the internet, it's going to be big. It's going to be big. And people went, oh, well, we're more of a personal touch base, that kind of thing. Now, every business has to be a digital business. There's no business that really survives without having a digital infrastructure in place, at least a website to be able to have to refer people to. But email and everything else is essential. Web conferencing is essential for businesses. And what I'm saying now is the moment that we're in here is going to be very similar to what it was when the internet came into the inception, and people were like, the internet, what on earth are we going to be able to use that for? How's that going to work? How's that going to add value to my business? And then what you'll start to see over the next 10 years or so is people developing more of a use case for the metaverse and how it's going to support their businesses. And that's going to start to drive that engagement and how people can start to really utilize virtual worlds to enhance their selling or to be able to deliver their products in a new and innovative and an immersive way. So the conclusions of this report, and this is where I'm going to conclude the live stream for today as well, is by 2030 it's possible that more than 50% of live events and 80% of e-commerce will be conducted in the metaverse. That's what the findings of this report are suggesting. The average internet user could spend up to 6 hours a day in the metaverse by 2030, which is not that surprising to me when I think about, once again, looking back 10, 15 years and people thinking about the internet, is if you told people, oh, you'll spend at least 6-7 days on the internet as part of your work, people being like, you must be kidding me. Now you've got a very similar thing coming up with the metaverse, where I can see it being such an influential part of everybody's day-to-day work. So another aspect of the conclusion of this report is that it requires a lot of collective leadership to ensure that actions are going to be taken shape. I'm going to say that again. It's going to take a lot of collective leadership to ensure that actions taken responsibly shape the evolution of this digital revolution within the metaverse. We're also going to be looking at how investment flows through metaverse technology, and they're going to be divided into kind of external investments from funds, corporations, and internal ones from corporate investments. You're going to find a lot of business investment within the metaverse space. This is not surprising to me as well. One of the things that clearly Meta's predicting, their most recent headset is clearly designed for business interaction and business operation. And that's something that's changed from potentially where people were looking at 3 or 4 years at being able to get involved with digital technologies, is you're going to have a lot of corporate investment, internal investment within organizations to bring the metaverse to life, really. And once again, it kind of finishes on the headline of the report, which is that there's the potential here to generate 5 trillion in value by 2030, making it really too big for businesses to just ignore. and also for policymakers and citizens, it's just something that they need to be able to understand, to be able to participate in and see the value in, because it's going to impact everyone. So that's some of my notes that have come from the McKinsey Company report, which is about creating value within the metaverse. Hope it's been useful. Thank you for joining, and hopefully we'll see you all soon.